This is Heroes of Annihilated Empires. I know, it's a mouthful. It's a strategy game that was developed by GSC Game World in 2006. Yes, that one. Again, one of the more obscure RTSs that was smothered by other releases at the time. It's actually quite a specimen. What do I mean by that?
Come on!
During this time, GSC was renowned in the gaming market as a studio that made historical RTSs with a grand scale, like Cossacks, American Conquest, and Alexander. This time, however, they thought, let's do fantasy, it's probably profitable, or let's make our own might and magic. We'll talk about it later. Speaking of presentation and graphics, it's pretty and full of color for 2006, which is jarring considering its peers during this generation. But it's pretty uninspired standard fantasy fare, though honestly through so many so-called deconstructions and parodies, it's a nice change of pace to have something this familiar. This can't be said of everything in this game. You have your elves, orcs, goblins, undead, yetis, you get the picture. To make everything run smoothly and not set any PCs on fire like Fear or Crisis did, they opted to use 16 rotation sprites for most units. With mixed results, honestly. When they die, they leave a pancake, which makes everything seem silly. Bigger models, like heroes and monsters, use 3D models. Overall, it's a pretty clever way to go around hardware limitations of that time. The graphics are not an eyesore, except for one thing. The sound design, though, is a mixed bag. The music is very generic orchestral stuff and gets repetitive fairly quickly. Plus, it starts right from the menu, it never stops, and it gets repetitive fairly quickly. Although, it seems familiar. Oh no.
How's life? Please do tell.
Well, I make videos, so not that good.
Bitch!
The other sounds, though... Again, stock sounds. Then again, it was 2006. Not many could afford Half-Life 2 sound design. Now for the gameplay, now that's a doozy. The game is giving you the option of playing 4 races. Elves, dwarves, ice people, and the undead. No humans, strangely. There is only one campaign for elves, and that's a development problem. We'll talk about it later. Skirmish is equally squalid with 5 maps, although you can download more if you know how where to look. It can be divided in 2 parts, RPG and RTS, but it's not like this other game. Let's start with RTS stuff. The strategy part is fairly standard. You have your workers, unit rosters, and your non-typical gamut of resources. Each race uses different array of replenishable resources, although the distribution of wealth isn't really made equal. The undead and the elves use 4 resource type each, the other 2 use all 6, which automatically makes playing them a somewhat hard proposition. Same thing can be said about unit population. Elves and undead have relatively cheap housing to alleviate that, and can have really huge armies in no time. The Water Nation and the Fire Nation don't have that. Their only way to increase populace is to build military barracks, which triple in resource cost for everyone built, which could mean that they are an elite faction that requires a bit more macro. This is compounded by caps on certain units, which can be increased by building the same structure. Usually it's 1 per building, which is not that optimal. A big thing to note is the armor system of this game. It works on subtraction, meaning that the overall damage is basically base damage minus armor, depending on the armor type, but it's never below 1. Considering the game is all about quantity and not quality, this is a simple and elegant solution, but there is a problem. Not every faction was made equal in that regard. You see, there's a thing called aura. It simply buffs or debuffs something in the vicinity. Some units have them and most of them are restricted by caps. All except one. All of this combined makes the game very unbalanced and most of the time favorable to those that can field huge armies cheaply right from the get-go, especially the undead. Controls are similarly simplistic. Units organize themselves into blocks and there is no formation controls, and the terrain doesn't play that much of a role, so inevitably the fights devolve into blobs versus blobs. Pretty to look at but not sophisticated. Same with workers. If left idle for too long, they will start chopping trees or mine stone. Not very engaging, but not distracting either. The RPG part is equally simple and somewhat broken, but in a good way. You can have wizards, warriors and rangers, which do basically the same thing for everything. They do typical hero stuff, killing mobs, gather artifacts, potions and spells. Once they level up, they have an option of picking between two random stat races, or up to wait a level and pick from all. The latter is not optimal, because the level cap is 200 or so picking this option effectively gimps your character. Once you build your character, they can be pretty devastating on their own, hacking hordes of enemies like a weed whacker, and if augmented by spells and potions, they are veritably the definition of endgame units. Another thing to note is that you can play skirmish exclusively in RPG mode, but I honestly find it somewhat boring because in reality it's basically Diablo with an end goal. Should have sounded like that honestly. On their own, these parts are very derivative, but together they make up an interesting combination. While it certainly can look at the basically Warcraft 3 bootleg, it's actually fairly different from it. Heroes are all about quantity. Quantity of units, spectacle, stats, you get the picture. Now for the story...
It's useless. What?
There's a problem that I can't alleviate at all. Modern systems can't run the cutscenes in this game, for some reason. I looked everywhere and there is no solution. And because of it, keeping up with the plot was hard and at times it takes a while jumps. So after a sleepless binge, I think I know what the story was about, so a bit of a warning.
Hey, is it in focus? Like I give a shit.
The story takes place in the dark age of alternate 2020, in which a disaster called UEFA Tournament 2020 has happened. During this catastrophe, the unwashed undead goblin hordes has ravaged the realm of Europe. With each beaten man, European and migrant alike, turned to their monstrous Gopnik. Allied with the British football hooligan liches, they turned their sight into the verdant magical land of Iceland. We take command of a coast guard named Elend, during the fall of Reykjavik, also known as City of Dawn for some reason. After redefining what party hard means through copious amounts of beer and hard base, the undead had scattered the Icelanders through the forests. After gathering people and acquiring skill boosts through homeless CCP Games employees, he combats the monstrous creature, an eloquent British hooligan hurling much more sophisticated insults and Warhammer miniatures. Defeating the abomination with a katana left by a wayward weeaboo, he decides to recruit the help of SAS druids and RIF, who were not swayed by the hooligan curse. They tell him that the British crown is now dismantled and missing, and without it, the Eastern European hordes will not stop their culturally enriching rampage. Now Elend is going through the merry journey through the lands of Swiss dwarves, Scandinavian trolls, and lands of Egypt, currently undergoing temporal distortions caused by pyramids and religious schisms between the old and the new. With the power of the British crown restored, Elend has no choice but to awake the Eyjafjallajökull volcano once again and bury the island to destroy the undead hordes and deny it for the British dominance. Now, I might have said some nonsense, but there are actually modern tanks and aircraft lying around validating my claim to the plot, And honestly, rummaging through video files, the real story is actually a generic fantasy plot about a big bad skeleton slaying elves, so...
I like my version better.
Now, what was the problem? It didn't sell well. At all. Are there multiple reasons for that? Yes. GSC at the time was developing Stalker, and it ate up all of the resources and made people in the studio antsy. Concurrently, Annihilated Empires was touted as a trilogy. Two big projects competing for attention was not healthy for the company. Thus, a lot of corners in the game were cut, and the timing was not on the game's side. People were not itching for the GSC brand RTS, and certainly not the standard fantasy. Overall, a very unfortunate fate for a promising franchise. Who knows, maybe we would have understood why there are military tanks and jets lying around, and got a new Might and Magic successor.
Conclusion.
Heroes of Annihilated Empires is an unfortunate game. In concept and sometimes in gameplay, taking command of really huge fantasy armies is an interesting idea that not many people have pulled off. But it's plagued with small map choices, generic visual style, balance problems, and most of all, an unfulfilled vision made during troubling times. It's somewhat poetic that plot-wise it basically depicts GSC as a whole. Once big and proud, now put down for dirt and had to start all over again from scratch. Maybe they'll be willing to give this franchise another go, maybe not. Would I recommend this game? Overall, I would cautiously advise you to try it. GOG and Steam sell the game for pennies, and even more so during sales. If you like having scale in your battles, then it's a solid recommendation. If you want something more nuanced, then it's a no. Thanks for watching, and forgive me for this irregular upload schedule. I've been working and the holiday seasons were not a good time to make something, so
Encountering enemy. Attacking! We will bury them.